Welcome to Have a Life Teaching, the podcast designed for educators who are dedicated to enhancing their teaching practice and creating a positive impact on their students' lives. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of education, exploring a wide range of topics related to curriculum, instruction, and assessment in K-12 schools. Together, we'll learn from the brightest minds in the education field. So if you're a passionate educator who's ready to take your teaching practice to the next level, join us as we explore the exciting world of education. My name is John Shimbari, signing in and saying, let's have a life teaching. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Have a Life Teaching podcast. So now, obviously, every teacher, every coach, when they're in a classroom, they want to see all their students equally vested in learning, excited about learning, asking a lot of self-generated questions. But the reality is there could be many circumstances that cause a student not to be as engaged in learning as we would like. For example, as a coach, sometimes when I go into schools, I will see students slumped over on their desk and might go over and ask that student, everything okay? And if the student still shrugs their shoulders, then I know that we're going to have to do more to empower the student, to engage the student in learning. And that is why I'm really excited today to have Aaron Hansen joining us. He is a former principal of a middle school in rural Nevada. He is a solution tree consultant and the author of the book, Heroes Within, a framework for empowering students to own their learning journeys. So Aaron, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, John. Happy to be here.
Why this book? And what particularly intrigued me was the title, Heroes. So can you go into that a little bit more?
Yeah, for sure. There's definitely a story here. I started my career as an English teacher, and then I was a principal of a middle school, a turnaround middle school. We made some really dramatic changes in a short amount of time. We started to get some attention first on a state level, then a national level. And it was interesting. We were chosen as a national model school at one point by the International Center for Leadership and Education. They brought us to their conference. They put us up on stage. They told about our story. And 6,000 educators stood on their feet and gave us a standing ovation. It was a really cool moment. At the same time, what people didn't know while they were clapping is there was a lot of contention within the school at the time. And the contention was that we felt like we were pulling teeth to get kids to learn. We felt like even though our systems were working at award-winning levels, we felt like we cared way more about their learning than they did or their parents did. Our kids had this attitude of compliance where they felt school was this 12-year active compliance they had to endure before they got out into the real world. We realized we were working at a level that wasn't really sustainable and we were going to burn out. That sent me down a rabbit hole of really trying to figure out, and I had some personal experiences too with some students that really impacted me on a really deep level that I write about in the book, and realizing that this wasn't unique, that so many of our kids are struggling to find any kind of relevance in what they're doing while they're in school and feeling any kind of sense of meaning in it. That's really where the book came from, is trying to solve two major problems. One is those kids who are stuck in a compliance-driven mindset, like I mentioned, and then other kids who are stuck in what I would call a fixed mindset, believing that their abilities or talents are already fixed or set, and that they're no good at school. School isn't for me or people like me or people like my family. And so that's what the book is trying to solve, is those two problems. And there's a real specific framework for doing that.
I love that, Aaron. And in fact, this conversation we're having is very timely because I've recently had some episodes with folks talking about, for example, the building blocks of teaching with Gretchen Bridgers, where she talks about really being clear on first your learning standards, then your assessment of those standards, then student engagement. But she doesn't leave it there. She talks about the fourth building block being exactly what you're talking about, Aaron, and that is student ownership of learning. When we are talking about schools such as yours in Nevada, that is award-winning, that has had at least student results, student impact, that's great, because now that school is in a position to think about, well, we as teachers know how to have improvements in student learning and get results. But how do we now help the students to care about this themselves? Because ultimately, we want them to be the lifelong learners. We want them to seek out information. That really makes sense to me, that what you're talking about, what Gretchen talked about, is that fourth step in teaching and learning, which is, again, teachers being facilitators of the learning, not the owners of that learning, that students are making their own meaning from what they're learning and becoming engaged in that. A follow-up question for you, Aaron, is can you describe what sometimes can happen long-term to a student who is not engaged, doesn't own the learning? And then could you also talk about what happens with even small shifts when students begin to feel control of their learning? What are the positive results of that?
It's interesting how these mindsets develop. And that's part of where the hero's title comes from, really, is this. I did a deep dive into a lot of the psychology, not just the educational pedagogy or strategies to use, but really understanding on a fundamental level why kids are stuck in these mindsets. And it boils back down to this idea of stories. So we define ourselves through the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves. And so kids, for example, who are struggling with a fixed mindset, they've arrived there based on a set of experiences. So, for example, as early as first grade, kindergarten, we start to pull small groups for intervention. Well, that's a good thing, I thought. Well, maybe if it's done well. If it's done poorly, then it doesn't work. And what happens is that kid continues to get pulled over and over and over again. And they start to say on a subconscious level, not conscious at all, but on a subconscious level, they start to tell a story. And the story goes like this. Well, there are those who are learners over there. And then there's me, because I get pulled every single time. And so over time of repeated failures or repeated stumbling, I guess, even, they start to be conditioned in their thinking to believe that I'm no good at school. School isn't for me. People like me, or people like my family. And once they start to tell that story and continue to tell that story, it loops in their mind. And eventually that becomes like the default programming that runs every time a similar situation comes up. We act that out. And eventually you'll attribute not only those habitual behaviors to performance in those certain scenarios, but you'll start to attach your very identity to those. To change those identities and change those mindsets, it's bigger than just teaching growth mindset language, and it's bigger than giving some kind of a pep talk. They have to behave their way out of this. They have to experience their way out of it because they've experienced their way into it. And the same thing could be said for the compliance-driven mindset largely too, is they're telling a story about what school is and their role in it. They're just biding their time. And in fact, if you talk to secondary kids, you don't have to go very far before you start to hear language that's akin to a minimum security prisoner, the same kind of language they would use. They talk about internalized economy systems, that's grades. They talk about social connections or cliques, belonging. They talk about little events that they might be looking forward to, but most importantly, they're talking about when they get out. It doesn't have to be this way. We can completely shift this in understanding pedagogically what we need to do, but also understanding some of the psychology and marrying the two together. And again, that's what the book's doing. To follow up with your question, what does it look like when we start to make some of those shifts? What's fascinating, what I've watched and witnessed in amazing transformations with kids, is when they start to make some kind of progress, then even if it's incremental, when they can see, like you mentioned before, when they can see what they're actually aiming at, when they can see the target or the learning goal that they're aiming at, and they're making progress towards hitting that goal, then that psychologically feels good, but it's bigger than that. There's also a physiological reward that takes place in the form of a dopamine release. And dopamine's called, in the popular literature, it's called the feel-good hormone, but that's inaccurate. It's actually a neuromodulator, which means it affects multiple systems within the brain and the body simultaneously. And what it says, it's a reinforcer. What it says is, hey, that thing you just did, do it again because that feels good. Behind every piece of motivation that we experience as human beings, including addiction, What we can do, understanding some of these principles, these psychological and physiological principles, and then the educational pedagogy of zone of proximal development, we can start to incrementally help kids grow just a little bit, a little bit, and a little bit. And they start to experience that success that lends itself to the telling of a new story about themselves.
Aaron, extrapolating from that further, let's talk about these strategies that will enable us to make those incremental positive changes in a student's sense of self-worth and efficacy. What are some strategies perhaps you did as a principal at your own school? And what strategies are you recommending in the book? What are some strategies for listeners to this podcast if they want to start doing something tomorrow to help their learners develop this growth mindset?
A couple things. One is make sure that kids can actually see what they're aiming at. Like you mentioned in the introduction, kids often don't know what they're actually supposed to learn. And it's like getting a little puzzle piece at a time. Every day you show up to class, but you've never seen the box. You don't know what it's supposed to look like when you're done. Helping kids actually see what it is they're aiming at will give them the opportunity to start to take some shots at it, at that target. That's really the first thing. And the single best way to do that is to provide models of proficiency. In other words, if I'm teaching a music class, what's the first thing that I do when I'm teaching a new section of music? I have them listen to that section of music. If I'm in a welding class, I help kids have a little model weld that they take into the welding booth before they start to practice it. Same thing in a language arts class or a math class. If they have models of what proficient work looks like, Rick Stiggins advocates, if they can see the target, they can hit the target. And so that's one. However, we give short shrift to that. We write the objective on the board and think that's sufficient, and it's really not. That doesn't illuminate the target for kids. Another thing that I would highly recommend for those teachers who are game and really want to try to change these mindsets that we're talking about is help their students track their own progress. And that incremental progress that they can start to track and then see that progression, that lends itself to the really powerful metacognitive conversations and reflections.
I agree wholeheartedly. Yes, I think it's important that objectives be posted and then discussed at the end of a period. Did we meet our objective? Yes or no? Why or why not? What are we going to do next? And in fact, that reminds me of an episode with Maureen Freiburn, where we talk about creating lesson objectives and success criteria. But to your point, we need to do more. And I want to highlight what you were saying, what I'm about to get to, which is this idea of success criteria. So yes, how can we put up exemplars of best practice? What does the project need to look like at the end? Have an actual example. Aaron, I sometimes tell teachers if they're going to do certain projects again or certain assignments again, year in and year out, to save different examples of what it is that students are supposed to accomplish. Yes, we want to see the best and what exactly we want our students to create, but I also suggest they keep a few samples of less than ideal work to model where certain projects and where the people who created them can continue to grow. Of course, no names, and that's why you want to use projects from years past and not from the current year if you have them. But I think another way to really demonstrate to students what they need to do, and this is tied to that success criteria, is to develop performance rubrics along with showing the exemplar. What are your thoughts on performance rubrics?
I have thoughts on that. I think about this stuff all the time, and I work with teachers all the time and coach teams. And what I talk to them about, what I encourage, because time is so limited for teachers and teacher teams, when I'm helping them do some standards work and really try to break down their standards, deconstruct them, and get clear about what proficiency actually looks like, because that's our first step. We have to know what proficiency looks like before we can communicate that with our students. What I'll often do, and this probably sounds counterintuitive, is I'll say, okay, let's look at the standard. Let's talk about what we think the essence of the standard actually is. And then let's either pull some models from previous student work, like you're talking about, and develop some level of inter-rater reliability. Or in other words, we all see quality work the same way. And sometimes we'll sit down and just create it. We'll say, okay, pretend like we're our fourth graders or our 11th graders or whatever, and let's produce some work that we would expect that we consider to be proficient. And we start with the model or the exemplar first. And then what I tell them is I say, okay, now that we have a version 1.0, and let's put version 1.0 draft and the date at the top, meaning we can change this as we go forward and we learn more. But we have this done. Done is better than perfect right now. And we're going to go the ready, fire, aim approach. And once we've got those models in place, then what I say to them is I say, okay, now why is this quality? Why is this quality? And they'll say, well, because it does this, it does this, it does this, it does this. And I say, great. You just wrote the beginnings of a rubric. And the reason why I suggest doing it that way is because oftentimes when people go about trying to develop performance criteria or rubrics, basically, often what they end up doing is they Google what other people have done. And honestly, a lot of times those documents are just as convoluted as the standards in the first place and just as interpretable. So without the model of proficiency first to be able to compare that back to, then we're still talking maybe the same words, but not necessarily meaning the same things. If I'm coaching a team and we've got an hour, I'm going to get them to that place in an hour.
To the other part of what you were talking about, getting students to see their own progress. You mentioned that as a strategy that teachers could use to help develop growth mindset in kids to get that dopamine going. What are some specific strategies teachers can use in the classroom to actually get students looking at their own data?
When we look at those learning goals that we have and we break it down into specific targets, and either whether those are sequential targets or whether those are what I call typical pitfalls on the pathway to proficiency targets, right? Typical reasons why kids might struggle. Once we have those, to be able to share those with kids and to be able to refer back to that on a really regular basis. And so, and helping kids do some, what I would call providing facilitated feedback instead of directed feedback. And what I mean by that is, like when I first started teaching English, I would wander around. I really wanted my kids to be better writers. I would wander around, I'd look over their shoulder and I'd say, hey, I love what you're doing here. You might consider XYZ here. And they would look at me, mostly freshmen, and they would nod their heads, okay, Mr. Hansen, okay, And then I would walk away and nothing would happen. Who owned the learning? It was me who was doing all of the work. And as soon as I said it, it just kind of floated off into the ether. The way that I would give feedback now, and I made some, I learned a few things to do a little bit better while I was still teaching, but understanding what I know now, I would do it completely differently. And that would be that I would have those targets that as a team, hopefully a collaborative team we've built out. And then what I would do is I would wander around with models handy, with the kids having their models. I would wander around, look over a kid's shoulder and say, hey, I love what you're doing here. But when you look at the model of proficiency that we talked about when we began this unit of learning, when you look at the model and you look at your work, how is it different? And they'll say, well, it looks pretty good. My claim's good. Yep, I agree. That's why I said I like what you're doing here. But what about your evidence? Well, I mean, it's good. Are you sure? Yeah, no, it's fine. Or, well, look back at the model. Do you see where, okay, here's where our evidence was. Now, where's your evidence? I'm not there yet. I agree. You're not there yet. What are you going to do about that? And they're going to say, well, I don't know, because they're not used to being asked that question. They're going to look at you and they're going to say, well, I don't know. And you're going to say, well, okay, well, this is essential. You actually have to learn this in order to contend in the world, because nobody's going to hand you anything when you walk outside of the walls of the school. You've got to have this. This is an essential skill. You don't know how to do it yet. What are you going to do about that? I don't know. And at that point, they probably really don't know. And at that point, we're going to offer them some choices. We're going to be able to say, well, look, you can look at the model. You can see if you can figure it out. You can work with a peer buddy, see if together you can figure it out, or some other options. But it just so happens I'm going to be running a little small group in the back of the room for the last 8 minutes of class around this very target. If you'd like, you're welcome to join me. And in the meantime, we're having kids track that progress. You're not there yet. Where are you at? Okay, write down the progress of that. And then what's your plan for improving that? And over time, there's a lot of detail in the book that explains exactly how to do this step by step so that you can help your students take those steps, even the most reluctant learners. Once they've started to take those steps and they've started to make some improvement, that's when we get the really exciting part happens, is that we're able to have these conversations, which I have numerous conversations recorded with kids where I get to ask them that question. Okay, you went from here, where you really weren't proficient in these particular targets, you really struggled with this, and now you're here. How did you do that? And in that moment, what's happening is they get to tell a story about their success. In other words, where they were a hero in their own learning journey, where they got knocked in the dirt, but got back up again. And through their perseverance and through their effort, they were able to achieve something. And so that metacognitive conversation becomes really powerful for changing that mindset.
What really resonated with me with what you were saying just now is how when you're walking around with the exemplar, you're asking students key questions. What did you do here versus what did you do here? And then when students tell you what they have done well and where they still need to grow, what you just said was then you do offer, for example, mini lessons. So what resonated was this chunking of the learning that you as the teacher were not telling students, oh, you got to do this, you got to do this, you got to do this, you got to do this. It's coming from them and it's step by step by step. And again, you're offering these mini lessons. Students can get better at those skills little by little. So my question is this: how would you recommend teachers host or facilitate these little mini lectures when students might have several that they should come in and out of, and there's only one of you, and there might be 3 or 4 different goals, for example, in writing that you're trying to get across to the students? How do you manage that as a teacher?
It's a really great question. And I have some phenomenal examples of transformations of teachers in the way that they're seeing their role in the classroom. Instead of being that deliverer of information or deliverer of content, to becoming truly a facilitator like you're talking about. And that's where, like I said, how I would turn that is to really moving away from directed feedback, where I do all the telling, this is what you need to do, this is what you need to be able to facilitate feedback, to say, hey, look, can you see where you're hitting in relation to this defined learning goal? Okay, and you're not there yet. What are you going to do about that? And it's not so much about, well, I wouldn't even necessarily call it mini lessons. I don't disagree necessarily with the term, but I think the way I would like people to think about that instead would be is conversations. There's going to be a few of us who over here in this group who have a conversation about this particular target and what might be holding us back from becoming proficient in that target. And it's interesting, I worked in a school in the San Joaquin Valley not too super long ago, and I watched as a teacher, and interestingly, months before, was so frustrated and just feeling like she was on the edge of a burnout, get to a place where she ran some small groups for the last 10, 15 minutes of class based on kids' own progress trackers that they're using to track their own progress. Anyway, with 15 minutes left in class, she said, okay, everybody look at your progress tracker. If you need help with this, you need to go over here. If you need help with this, go over here. If you want to work on this, come over here. And honestly, John, the most powerful in-class intervention that I witnessed that day, it was profound. Entire class, in a class where she was months before chasing behaviors, going home absolutely exhausted. She's standing there observing what's taking place. And the most powerful intervention that I witnessed, and I asked her later, I said, what do you think was most powerful? She agreed with me. It was kids at the whiteboard who were trying to figure something out. They had nothing other than some whiteboard markers and each other. And I said, you know what? That is so fascinating to me, because I 100% agree. I said, why do you think that is? Why do you think that was so powerful? And she said, because they were actually trying to learn it. They were actually trying to figure it out. And I said, yeah. So months ago, when we had our initial conversations, what would that have looked like if you had tried to run intervention stations like that in this, at-risk place or this community? What would that have looked like if you had tried to do that before really empowering these kids to be owners of their learning? And she said, Aaron, they probably would have written things on the board they shouldn't have, markers, they would have thrown them at each other. I would have been chasing the behaviors and I would have been exhausted. That's the difference.
So how did that teacher, Aaron, get from that place of desolation where she was afraid kids were going to throw markers at one another to this situation, this nice situation you're describing, where students are owning the learning? What were the steps or the progressions to go from non-empowered to empowered?
In the book, what I've outlined, the book is really marrying the educational pedagogy, the steps that we need to take from an educational standpoint, along with the psychological principles for changing these mindsets on a fundamental level, on a deep level. Really, it started with her mindset changing to be able to try some of these things. And then she really, with a lot of effort, started to follow the steps that are outlined within the book. And what I've termed those steps is the hero maker framework. And the idea is that, again, there's a learner and a hero are synonymous. They're the same thing. But basically what we're talking about is how do we help kids understand who they really are as a learner, as a hero. Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung, going back to some of our foundational psychological thinkers, they said that we're all on a hero's journey in our lives. We're all heroes in our own story. And if you think about it, somebody were going to make a movie about your life, who's the main character? But kids don't necessarily understand that. Instead of feeling like the hero in their story in school, they feel victimized by the system. They feel like they're making choice after choice after choice outside of school down to the 30-second increment as they switch from TikTok to YouTube or whatever else. They're making choice after choice to curate their very experiential lives. And then they come into school and it feels slow and it feels archaic and they even feel victimized by the system. And when you're victimized, you have some choices. You can either resist it, and we see overt resistance at times, or you can fawn, what psychologists call fawn. And what fawning is when you do just enough to get by to keep your assailants from coming after you again. I'll get that B so that my mom stays off my back, or my coach stays off my back, or my teacher stays off my back, if I happen to be lucky enough to have such adults in my life.
As a funny little anecdote, I often tell teachers, don't just accept volunteers answering questions because you're getting a skewed idea of who actually understands and who doesn't. And what you're actually teaching students to do is those students who don't understand, they learn pretty quickly. As long as they don't bother anyone else and impede anyone else's learning, if they just at a minimum sit there and be quiet and respectful, they could get away with that. So when you mentioned this term fawning, that's what's coming to my mind.
It's reinforcing that compliance that so many of our kids feel. And so many of our kids are just saying, why do I need this? And it's a valid question in an era where we can learn anything, anywhere, at any time, at any speed. And we have artificial intelligence in our pockets. Like, people are really asking the question, why do I need this formal educational experience at all? And I would argue that we have to take a look at our fundamental purpose in education. It can't be just about learning discrete knowledge, which is free and ubiquitous and in my pocket, nor can it be about even learning discrete skills, content skills, but instead it has to be learning about those most enduring skills, but also, so it's about learning, but we have to make a shift to where our fundamental purpose is the development of the learner.
Now, on that note, Aaron, and you were talking about this before, the shift to the learner. And I don't expect you to go into details on any of these because I would hope that people, again, would pick up the book. But you mentioned that there were 7 steps to creating this growth mindset learner. Would you mind just taking us very quickly what those steps are?
There's 6. The first step is helping kids see what it is they're actually aiming at. So in other words, communicating the learning goal in crystal clear terms. And so we've talked a little bit about that. The second step is really establishing relationships of trust with our students. And I go into great detail about what that actually means. I've never been to a school. I've been to almost all 50 states doing this work, helping schools. And I've never been to a school where anybody said, oh yeah, relationships, we don't do that here, right? Like, no one's ever said that. Like, everybody understands that relationships are important, but I think most of us miss the opportunity in a mentor, mentee, or teacher student type of relationship, the opportunity to really develop the mentee or the student. By understanding some foundational psychological principles about why kids don't try, or why they're holding back and just maybe doing just enough to get by, which is all rooted in fear, all an ego response, a protective response. And when you understand that and you develop a relationship of trust, then you can ask a kid to take a step towards the darkness of their potential. And if they really trust you, they'll take a step. But you better make sure that you know their zone of proximal development, because if you ask them to take that step, you better not burn them. You better make sure that they can be successful. But they'll take a step towards that darkness commensurate with the level of trust that they have in you. And so I explain really clearly what that means and how to develop that trust and what specifically to do with that trust. The next step is all about making sure that our content is worthy of a hero's effort. We have to be talking about and working with things that actually matter as much as we possibly can. The next one is that shift from directed feedback to facilitated feedback, helping students track their progress. The next step is metacognition, engaging kids in those reflective experiences for the purpose. And we kind of give short shrift to metacognition in education these days. We say, oh, it's thinking about your thinking or learning about your learning. It's deeper than that. It's about reflecting upon a learning experience for the purpose of informing future learning experiences. And on a psychological level, even deeper, on development of the learner, it's reflecting upon a learning experience for the purpose of informing yourself about yourself. Like, who am I? You actually accomplished this thing that was really hard. How did you do that? I went this, I did this, I made these efforts. Oh, you mean to tell me that your effort had something to do with your success? Well, yeah. Well, that's interesting. That's really interesting. Do you think that applies to other areas of your life? Maybe, or future challenges? Maybe. Yeah, maybe. What does that mean about what I hear you saying is if I work hard, I get better. Yes. Okay. That's an interesting thing to know about yourself, isn't it? Yeah, it is. We help them tell that story, facilitate that new story that's being told. And then the last step is making sure that kids actually have a vision for their future. And that's not about what their job is going to be, but what kind of life do they want to live? What do they want their relationships to look like or feel like? Going into great detail about how they want their life to feel. And then there's an activity called back mapping your journey that takes you backwards to today. What am I going to do today in order to start moving towards this?
As you were speaking, I was thinking about a question that's still maybe the elephant in the room that I know listeners might be asking themselves, but I think you partially answered it when you were talking about getting students to map their journey, to discuss experiences. To me, that could be a great form of assessment where you're looking at how a student described their journey in the beginning of this process or an experience, and then maybe how they would describe their experience that they had after the teacher has implemented the first 4 or so steps. To me, that could be a great form of qualitative assessment. But I'm going to ask the question that is probably the elephant in the room, which is, how do you measure growth mindset?
The way that I would say it is qualitative to a large degree. I mean, there are tools that you can use to try to quantify some of that for sure, like to measure levels of self-efficacy beliefs. I have a high school that's doing some pretty serious work around this right now. And so they're trying to use some of that hard data through some surveys to collect data to measure the impact. But what I'm more excited about is, imagine this, that at the end of their senior year, for example, and you could do this wherever, it doesn't matter, but in any grade level, I think, but at the end of this senior year, these kids, they stand up to give a presentation to an audience that they've invited to be there. They say, as that portrait of a graduate, to be able to say, here are my plans going into the future. Here's what my current plans are and the path that I'm going to try to pursue. But let me talk to you about some of the things that I've learned, not only academically, but let me talk to you about the things that I've learned about myself as I've gone through this experience of learning. And for them to be able to say, in essence, I know with these future challenges that I'm going to face, I know that I can do hard things. I know that I can face those difficulties that are going to come, because inevitably challenges and setbacks will come. I know that I can face those. And the reason I know that is because I have done it in the past. And let me tell you about some of those experiences where I got knocked in the dirt. I got it really handed to me. And here's how I climbed out of it. Here's how I was able to develop my sense of self-efficacy and understand truly who I am and what my potential is if I give my maximum effort and continue to move.
Aaron, we've talked a lot about growth mindset, how to help students develop this sense of growth mindset. What have we not talked about empowering our young people to take ownership of their learning?
That there's hope. As I wander around in my travels and I work with schools, I see so many teachers and Phi Delta Kappan magazine just published an article not too super long ago about this very thing, that so many of our colleagues, so many professionals are leaving the profession because they don't feel like they're making the difference that they wanted to when they signed up in the first place. And they feel like the system is putting them in this position. And then kids, their attitudes, their beliefs, their mindsets, it's so difficult. They're leaving the profession. And it makes my heart so sad because I know what's possible. I know there's hope. And I know it's not that difficult to make some of the transitions or shifts to what we're talking about here. In fact, I've witnessed this multiple times. I've witnessed the stress melt off of teachers over the few weeks as they start to implement the framework. And the reason why is because it's not that the job is necessarily way easier, because it's always going to be hard. But instead of feeling like they're constantly dumping energy into the process, they start to feel like they're deriving energy from it, walking in and towards their, what Michael Fullan would call their moral purpose. They're actually making a difference, and not just around 5% better on some state test that was built for a century ago. They're empowering kids to understand who they actually are in their learning journey. They're the hero in their own story.
Aaron, where can people find out more about you and the work that you do?
My email address, Aaron Hansen, AARONHANSEN 77 @gmail.com. And I'm happy to engage with folks there. You can always reach out to my publisher, Solution Tree. If you want, you can reach me through them. And also, I'm on Twitter at Aaron Hansen 77.
Thank you so much for your time today, Aaron. This has been a very informative conversation.
Thank you, John.
Thank you for listening today. I hope you got some great tips that you can bring back into your teaching. Remember, have a life teaching without sacrificing your own. Also, don't forget to subscribe and be well.